Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street is a progressive campaign agency that specialises in community organising. We partner with businesses, organisations, unions and social democratic parties from around the globe to develop community organising strategies and train their leaders to build power from within their community. And in 2022, Dunn Street will continue to work with folks that want to organise, inspire others, take action and create change. To find out how you can partner with Dunn Street, hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. Today's episode is also presented to you by Maurice Blackburn. Maurice Blackburn's dust diseases team have accumulated more than 20 years of experience in asbestos litigation and pride themselves on ensuring that their clients not only receive the best compensation result, but that they are supported during their stressful and traumatic time. And Maurice Blackburn are currently looking for a passionate full-time associate to join their dust diseases team in their Brisbane office. To apply, simply go to mauriceblackburn.com.au/careers. I've been reading that ad out for a while. Surely you must have employed someone by now. I know that I've been reading it out for a while because I've actually got good at reading it out. Normally, I make an absolute hash of it. Anyway, Maurice Blackburn, go work there. Fantastic law firm. Hello and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left politics and organising podcast out each Friday that dives into the progressive issues and the campaigns and the people leading them from home and abroad. On this week, we are joined by a good friend of ours, the former communications director to both the Tony Blair Labor government and the Julia Gillard Labor government. John McTernan will join us. Michael, where'd that come from? John McTernan will join us for today's episode, in which we're just going to do a bit of an update on how things are going in the UK for the Labor Party. There's been a lot of stuff happening with Boris Johnston and his government's moving from one crisis to another. Obviously, we now have a war in the Ukraine. That wasn't on anyone's bingo card for 2022, I can assume. So there's so much to talk about. I just wanted to get John on the show, just have a quick debrief with him about how things are tracking for Labor. Even we're sort of at the halfway mark of this current election cycle in the UK for 5-year terms. So long. So look forward to having a chat to John today about that. If you like the show, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and Stitcher. And if you like the show, be sure to give us 5 stars on Apple Podcast and on Spotify when you're done listening to today's episode, or leave us a review on Apple Podcast or Podchaser. And for all the updates, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and LinkedIn. Okay, let's get to today's episode. We are taping this one on a Tuesday evening on Wurundjeri land in the heart of Melbourne. And the reason why we're probably taping this one a little bit later in the evening as opposed to normal is because we need to accommodate our guests' time zone. A good friend of the show, former communications advisor to Labor governments in both the UK and Australia, to both Tony Blair and Julia Gillard, and third or fourth time on the show, John McTernan. Welcome back to Socially Democratic.
It's great to be back. Thanks.
We've got a lot to talk about, and I really wanted to get you on the show really to sort of just give us an update on how things are going in the UK for Labor, and obviously there's been a lot going on in Europe over the last couple of weeks as well, to get your take on that. Before we jump into it, I've just come back from Adelaide. A fantastic result for the Labor Party in South Australia, with the election of Peter Malinauskas and the Labor team. I don't know if I know obviously, you lived out here for a number of years. The Labor Party in Australia is very close to your heart. Were you managing to try and catch any of the media clip-ins or get a sense of the election?
Yeah, look, as soon as the polls closed, I got onto the ABC and was following Anthony Green and his predictions, and I was overjoyed when I saw how big the swing was. And I think it goes to a crisis in conservatism in Australian politics, which is the Liberals in Adelaide have never worked out why Labor won. So Labor can't win forever. The Liberals got in, but they didn't have a project. They weren't governing. They didn't know what question facing the future of South Australia they were the answer to, and they've been swept aside. And I think my advice to my friends and colleagues in the South Australian Labor Party is, yes, start governing. Yes, start sorting things out. But don't neglect to tell the public repeatedly how bad the situation is, how badly the Liberals had run down the government, that is much. I mean, it's always great to stop and say it's much worse than we thought, and actually have inquiries into what those guys did and really stick not just the defeat on them, but stick the whole of the record, all the failures of the government, because it's a very short, all parliamentary terms are short, and it's hard to turn around really difficult things quickly. So I'd say it's a great victory. It should mean 2 terms because it's such a big swing. So plan for 8 years, but in the first couple, really muddy up the opposition, really set out the definition of the problems you're going to solve, and then govern for that 8-year cycle. And if you think about a 2-term cycle for governing in, you can probably get yourself a 3rd term. And with that kind of thing, you can actually fundamentally change the nature of it. But I think there's a crisis in the Liberal Party in Australia, which they don't understand why they're losing urban centres. I see their frustration with Victoria. They hate the fact that Melbourne's not a Tory city. They hate the fact that Adelaide's not reliably Tory. They hate the fact that urban centres are not they just can't adapt to the modern world. We've got to stick that on them now in South Australia, but in forthcoming state elections, but also in the federal election.
It's amazing if you look at both Victoria and South Australia, the election history since the 1960s, up until the 1960s, both in Victoria and in South Australia, it was dominated by the Liberal Party. And since I read this during the week, since they restructured the electorates to basically remove gerrymandering in South Australia in the late 1960s, which then led to the election of Don Dunstan.
That's right.
The Liberal Party have wedged themselves in between the government's successive terms of the Dunstan government, the Bannon government, the Rand government, and now hopefully a long-serving
the Malinauskas government.
Only 1 term. They've only they've won out of government, but they couldn't hold. And similar in Victoria as well. If you look back from the Kane era all the way through today, I think they've won 3 in Victoria. They've won 3 elections. Period.
No, it's really it's about accommodating to what the modern world is: urbanization, densification, public transport need for some form of social housing, all kinds of things which the UK Conservatives have managed to adjust to. That actually they can make themselves adapt to what the public want. It seems that the Liberals keep wanting to fight in a previous decade, and the voters give them a chance. They go, okay, you're not changed. You got to go and take some more time out, and it really does feel to be. I think there's a tension in modern conservatism across the world, which is that they tend to win with individuals. Look in New Zealand with John Key and how well they won with John Key, but then they've got no clue how to win without John Key. They tend to win with leaders who basically adopt centre-right versions of social democratic policies, progressive policies, but the parties are more and more feral about having right-wing solutions. And that means they drift further and further away from a connection with reality, which they used to be grounded with when they had more MPs, when they had more urban MPs. And the thing is, you have to rethink yourself completely if you've been on such a long losing streak. You need to rethink the fundamentals, but it's not clear who's going to do that.
Well, it was a great result of the weekend, and congratulations to Malinauskas and to his team, and to Reggie and everyone at head office. Fantastic achievement, really hope to see the government do some great things in the next 4 years. But let's turn to the UK, and I want to start off by talking about the Labor Party. I think the last time we had you on the show was after the Scottish elections and the local council elections that happened up and down the country, and elections in Wales as well. But I just wanted to sort of first of all get a sense of how you think Labor is now faring under the leadership of Keir Starmer. He's been in there since April 2020. I noticed that Labor has now led in successive national polls, and at no stage did Corbyn ever lead when Boris Johnson was PM. What is the general consensus around how Labor is tracking at this present time?
The cliche is always that governments lose elections, oppositions don't win them, and so there's no doubt that the Tories, and we should come back to this a bit later, the Tories have managed to throw away a landslide victory. They won by an 80-seat majority in the UK. They don't govern as though they got 80 seats. They govern as though they're a minority government at times. But that 80-seat majority, electoral mountain to climb, we've got all the details of it. It's just it's virtually never been done in the UK to turn that kind of defeat around within one electoral cycle. I think most people when Keir got elected thought that he was going to be the leader to reconstruct the party in the way that Neil Kinnock did in the 1980s, and that possibly he could, after two cycles, be a challenger for the next election. I would say Labour are now in with a really good shot of forming a government in the next election. So the Tories have lost the next election, in my view. Labour have yet to win the election by sealing the deal with the electorate. But in effect, what you've seen is a couple of cycles. What took two elections for Neil Kinnock to do in 87 and 92 has been done in 2 years by Keir. And look, partly that is the nature of modern politics. Things are moving much faster than they have, and British politics are fundamentally unstable. That's shown by the Brexit referendum, the Scottish referendum, the Scottish parliamentary elections. There's a kind of every election kind of confounds your expectations. The Tories get a minority in 2010, they get a slim majority in 2015, they lose majority in 2017, they get a landslide in 2019. So everybody kind of, Johnson wants to think he made a new settlement with voters, but basically that's been chipped away by Labour. And I think it's been by a couple of things. Obviously, there's the thing you have to do, which is when you have your worst election defeat since the 1930s, you have to define yourself as not being a part of that defeat and define yourself against that defeat. So Keir's done that quite doggedly and stolidly. Like, I'm not Corbyn, I've got a different front bench. He's taken a while because of factional pressures inside the parliamentary caucus to give himself the front bench team he wants. But he's got that team. It's a confident team. Person for person, it's more than a match for the Tories. More importantly, there are people in this front bench team who've got ministerial experience, cabinet experience. You've got some kind of weight to what they say. But really, the big thing is he's established Labour as the safe option, and in one sense, that was always going to be the strategic challenge for Labour. Was you can't be funnier, you can't be more popular, you can't be more populist than Boris Johnson, you can't be more the guy down the pub you'd like to have a drink with than Boris Johnson. A party animal, again, we'll come back to that. But you can be more serious. And I've always thought, and I've probably said it to you, I've always thought that the opportunity for Labour was, if Boris Johnson thinks he's Churchill, remember what happened to Churchill. He won the Second World War. He defeated Mr. Hitler, and he asked to be elected for that reason. And the voters went, no, we'll have a Labour government. And Clement Attlee was probably one of the least charismatic leaders the Labour Party's ever had. Stolid, man with a plan. And I always thought that kind of Churchill, Attlee, Johnson, Starmer was a potential way of thinking about this. And very carefully, very cautiously, Starmer's presented himself as a man with a plan, and showing up the weaknesses in a guy who is the class joker. The guy who wants to be seen as the funniest man in the room in every meeting. I've been told by senior civil servants that if there's any more than 3 people in a meeting, Boris Johnson won't make a decision, he'll make a joke. So that kind of that has really worked well for Keir. So he's played a very weak hand, very, very well, and he's done that in a context where oppositions have found it very hard to get any publicity, any oxygen, because the pandemic became the only issue, and then we've had the short break, and then we're now in a war, a major global conflict with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which again we can come back to. So I think it's been Starmer's done in 2 years what it took Kinnock 2 electoral cycles to do. The question is, can he in the next 2 years do what Blair did in one electoral cycle, in one short term in opposition? So I think that's he's half climbed the mountain and can be really proud of what he's done. The next bit is going to be at least as hard.
What state is the party in? You mentioned there that he's now got a good team that around him in Westminster, but the membership, it was such a terrible story, such a you and I have talked about it on countless other podcasts, but watching the membership be flooded in with these people that I don't think generally actually had Labor values, but swelled the ranks and then created this division within the membership, and saw some really, really ugly stuff. And then, which had similar, you know more, you're a much stronger student of the Labor Party history in the UK, but it had that sort of militant tendency, sort of retroness about it again, which what I want to ask you is, has there been a need for uniting the membership again, or has there been any sort of restructure within the membership about how we conduct ourselves, how we exchange our views? It's great to be a broad church. I think we that's good for politics, right? But we also need to have some norms about how we conduct ourselves, and being anti-Semitic ain't one of them, right?
Yeah, look, that's a really good question. I think the emblem of how badly the Labour Party have been led under Corbyn was the investigation of the Labour Party by the Human Rights Commission, which found that the Labour Party was institutionally anti-Semitic. The only other party ever investigated by the Human Rights Commission are the fascist British national parties. That's how badly we'd fallen. When that report came out, Jeremy Corbyn quibbled with the detail of it. He wouldn't accept the report in total, wouldn't accept responsibility. He wasn't the leader anymore, but he wouldn't accept responsibility for it. So he was suspended from Labour Party membership. He's allowed back into the Labour Party. He was suspended. The whip was suspended from him in the parliamentary caucus. So he's an independent MP at the moment. And if he apologises, there may be an opportunity for him to rejoin the Labour Party. But as it is, he'll be an independent at the next election, will stand against a Labour candidate, will be expelled from the Labour Party and defeated in his seat. So symbolically, that big change is going on there. I think what has been helpful for the Labour Party is the membership has shrunk, and some of the people who came from the far left have left. And they've left to go back to the parties they were in, the fringe far left parties. And in all honesty, that's where they should have stayed. I do think there's a danger of one thing being lost in all this, which I think the Corbyn manifesto is a fascinating one to read, not because of what it answers correctly, but because it actually asks some fundamental questions about the structural working life, about the involvement of workers in the organisations they work for. 86% of us in the UK work in the private sector. With the decline of trade unionism, very few workers have much say in how in their wage bargaining, in the way the companies run. So kind of industrial democracy, workers' involvement, the power balance between labour and capital. So there's been a real shift in markets all across labour markets all across the global north. They asked a question about that. They asked a question about energy prices, about housing. So the fascinating thing about the Corbyn challenge is that the energy and intellectual energy, so the physical energy, the intellectual energy, the political energy that was brought in from outside, from people who want a progressive settlement for Britain, that shouldn't be, they shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's some really fundamental questions, and this Labour government, which I do expect to see a minority Labour government, needs to have a programme of fundamental reform to address the question. So some of the younger and more idealistic people who were drawn in by Corbyn have stayed, which is good, and a lot of the ferment of ideas of people around the left has stayed. And in my view, it is an important part for centre-left people, Blairites, progressives, whatever you call the grouping that I'm within, to engage with the intellectual energy and some of the left ideas. As I said, they're not the right answer, but they're the right question. And if we don't answer fundamental questions, then you can't be a government that reforms in a way that, say, Hawke Keating did, because they addressed the fundamental questions. So the way that Attlee did in the UK in 1945, the way that Blair did in 1997, the way that even Wilson did in the 1960s. Labour governments in the UK don't come along very often. We win about 1 in every 3 elections on average. Which means we need to have a fundamental change program, a reform program that we've thought through, that we implement. For me, that's part of the challenge for the next half of the leadership of Keir Starmer in the next 2 years up till the next election. What is the question facing facing the UK? What's the question shaping the future of the UK, to which Labour and only Labour are the answer? And what is the programme that is the answer? So I think, 2 years sorting the party, 2 years making clear that we need fences, boundaries with the left, that there's a role for the left. It's just not inside some of the left. It's just not inside the Labour Party. And the other part of this, which I should have mentioned at the top, the union movement has changed. And look, as you know, the thing about unions is they, in a way, need a Labour government more than anybody else, because their members need a Labour government. Their members actually need the conditions that a Labour government can create. And so they've got moderate leadership now. And Unite, which had been the big backer for Jeremy Corbyn, which had Len McCluskey, former member of Militant himself, they've now got a general secretary who's got an industrial agenda, but not a political agenda. And she's been really clear. She's not going to interfere in the Labour Party. She's going to be demanding the right settlements for her workers. And that's why she got elected. She's a left candidate, but she got elected because she was going to focus on the issues of members. And I think that is a good thing. If the union movement and the Labour Party, so Labour movement and the Labour Party, have overlapping interests, but they're not identical. And as long as we understand what those are, we understand the terms of trade. So I think we're in a good situation organisationally, in a good situation in terms of membership, in a good situation in terms of the parliamentary party's leadership. The challenge is, if Labour is going to form a minority government, we need 300 seats in the UK. That's 100 more than we have at the moment. That means 100 really good MPs have to be selected. That's a huge task. A huge task.
And look, that was one of the takeaways, I think, from the South Australian state election. Was one of my takeaways when I think about, and everyone had a hot take on why Labor won. But there was certain key seats where Labor pre-selected incredibly early. And not only did they pre-select them early, they resourced them, and they then gave them a strategy and a plan to go out there and communicate a good message with the electorate. Now, the electorates in South Australia are reasonably big. They're 20,000. So, even one candidate with a group of volunteers can get around there and have those conversations. Lucy Hood springs to mind in the seat of Adelaide. A huge margin to make up. But, geez, Lucy was out every weekend talking to people. And you can't underestimate that in the role of trying to claw back and win voters' hearts and minds, and not just sort of assume that. One of the things that frustrates me from political strategists is that they just assume that because the demographics are now this, it will remain thus. There's no thought process into going and say, well, no, let's win in the argument, seat by house, person by person. And I want to ask you a question about the polling. Where do you see Labor making gains at this point in time? I know, as you said, 100 seats, a long way to go, but certainly the polling is suggesting that Labor are coming back. Where are they coming back? Is it geographical? Is it by?
Yeah, so Labor, it's a good question. Labour are getting stronger in areas where they were already strong. So London, ironically, which is where Boris Johnston had his base. He was mayor of London, elected twice. London is now written off by the Tories as totally Labour. It's written off so much that the Tories really basically want all the housing that's needed in the UK just be built in London. Because it doesn't matter. There'll be Labour voters if it's social housing, if it's affordable housing. So London, but there's also been part of the pandemic has been, the Great Reset, the Great Resignation, the great people re-examining their lives, and the dynamic of an overpriced London housing market has been spreading young professionals into towns around London, into areas which have been previously very solidly Tory, and the changing nature of the country around London and the home counties, your Hampshires, your Kents, your Essexes, whatever. People are talking now. People in the last election, the Tories had a target of the red wall. This Labour seats, which were so solid, but that they believed were available to the Tories because they had characteristics that were similar to Tory seats in the southeast of England. They took those in a big sweep. We're seeing a blue wall, Tory seats that look invulnerable. Actually, you look at the social composition, look at the change in them, and like you say, if a candidate goes and meets everybody in their electorate, they can convince them. And if it's a different Labour Party, I think the Labour Party alienated. So the voters have come back from the ones who just went you gave us Jeremy Corbyn once, fair enough. You've given him us twice. What do we have to do? We have to defeat you massively until you get the point. There's those people coming back. There's ordinary working class voters who they lent their votes to the Tories to get Brexit done. Brexit's got done. And Brexit's now no longer a political issue in terms of are you for it or against it. It's a fact. We've left the European Union. The issue of what relationship we'll have with Europe is yet to be defined. What we can see in the way the government are running it is they have no clue how to do it. They have no clue how to be close to our biggest single market, how to exploit being not in it without annoying the people in it, without creating barriers to exports and to trade and to movement of labour. And so those Labour, you could say it very crudely, the Labour voters in the north of England, in the red wall seats in the Midlands, they voted for a high spending, high tax, high spending Tory party because they saw in Boris Johnson a figure who was he's not a Thatcherite. He was not going to cut public spending. He's clearly a man who wants to spend public money. He's trapped inside his party by his chancellor, who is a Thatcherite, who won't let him spend money. And that tension's working out. And I think tensions work out really quickly now, which is like people voted Tory in Labour seats. They're looking at it and they're going, but what have I got for it? In the next election in 2024, most likely, average households will pay £3,000 a year more in tax. That their energy bills are doubling. Inflation's heading to 10%. Under those circumstances, you might have got, the Tories were hoping to have a second chance at the election. But what you're seeing is traditional Labour voters coming back. Now, not fully back. It's probably been a 5% swing to Labour, a solid 5% swing since the last election, which is enough to put Labour between 275 and 300 seats. It's not enough to create a majority. But no parties in Parliament are going to support a minority Tory government. So Labour is the only option for a minority government. So we're coming back, and it feels as though it's one of those ones where the public are going to go, you lost our trust. You're definitely on the right path. You definitely look like the kind of people we could vote for. And Keir Starmer, like you look like a man I can trust. I'm going to give you a chance, but I'm not going to give you everything. So a kind of two-step probably for the Labour Party: win a minority government and run that minority government until you prove to the public you changed, prove your competence, and then call a snap election to get a small majority with the final swing that you need. So Labour is also seeing a Tory party that has its own internal problems. We were talking about my view of the Liberals not knowing how to win back Melbourne or Adelaide, really, or Victoria or South Australia. Boris Johnson's a compromise. He was for Brexit, but he's actually for immigration. He's a cosmopolitan liberal. His granddad was Turkish. He's got American citizenship. He's a citizen of the world, the very thing which half the Tory party hate, half the Tory party want to oppose. And so he was the compromise because he could win Labour voters. But to win and keep Labour voters, you need to do Labourish things, and the Tory party is unable to bring itself to do Labourish things. And I think that's the fundamental problem they've got. So Labour have got a plan to spend £28 billion on getting to net zero if elected. Now, there's a lot of blue-collar jobs there. There's a lot of insulation for middle-class homes. There's a lot. £28 billion is a big programme to win hearts and minds and create jobs opportunities and to tackle the greatest challenge of our time. So I think in that sense, you can see that Labour's got a lot of the elements together, and the Tories' confidence was that they're a fourth-term government, and they're looking for a fifth term, and nobody's won that. So there's a bit of tiredness in them. Nobody in democratic period has ever won a fifth term in the UK. So the tiredness of the government, they've gone through 4 elections, more than that with reshuffles, and they don't seem to have any new ideas, and that seems to us to be a big challenge.
I want to ask you about the Ukraine war and the way that it's playing out domestically in the UK. But before we do that, for our Australian listeners that may not have been following some of the the crises or the scandals that are following the Johnson government, starting with the parties that were happening in 10 Downing Street over the Christmas period when the country was in lockdown, and how that's played out. What impact is that having on voters' attitudes towards this tired, jaded Tory government?
So I think the Tory strategy was to acknowledge that there were a fourth-term government looking for a fifth term by changing the terms of trade, by changing it to effectively saying we're a first-term Johnson government looking for a second Johnson term. So kind of rebranding that the leadership is the change. And there's definitely a time for change mood around it. So who can capture that is up for debate. The PM Boris Johnson had a problem anyway with his proposition. His proposition was, first, thank me for Brexit. Now, like I said, Churchill wasn't thanked for beating Mr. Hitler, so very unlikely the British voters who are far less deferential now are going to thank him for Brexit. Then it was like, thank me for the pandemic. And one of the ironies of the pandemic is the bad management of it, which led to 50,000 deaths that were unnecessary. We moved to lockdown in Britain far too slowly. And the PM famously said, "I'll let the bodies pile up in the streets." He was very callous about that. The PM was unpopular and losing and getting more and more unpopular until the vaccine was rolled out in the UK. We had a very quick vaccine rollout, and I think it's interesting to see the role in politics the vaccine rollout has had. Had Trump worn a mask and had Trump rolled out a vaccine, he might still be president. And had the federal government taken responsibility for a vaccine program, bought stuff on the open market, and stepped in and not let AZ get the bad reputation that it got, you could have a different politic. The politics are formed by the big actions by the government. So the vaccine rollout has been it rescued the reputation of the government, the reputation of the Prime Minister. And like I think I said before, he's the life and soul of the party. He's a joker. It turns out he was having parties at Number 10 right through the lockdown, right through the period of when we had real restrictions on our social lives. The number of people who could visit, people couldn't go to see sick parents in hospital. People couldn't go to funerals. A very small number of people were able to go to funerals. So life events, weddings were postponed, all kinds of things. But in Number 10 Downing Street, where the Prime Minister both lives and works, it turns out there was a series of parties that broke all the rules. Now, this started as one of those kind of inside the Beltway scandals where it was in a paper. Honestly, when it was first raised by Keir Starmer in Question Time, in Prime Minister's Questions, I thought, this will go nowhere. I thought, like most commentators and most people on the inside of politics, the issue of Boris Johnson is everybody knows he's a hypocrite. Everybody knows he's a liar. Everybody knows he plays fast and loose. So, like, it's in his character. People elected him knowing all this. They're not going to worry about this. It turns out he pushed it too far, which I think always happens to people who, in a sense, who ride their luck as politicians. He pushed it too far, and I think he thought we could ride through it. It's just one story. It turned out to be a string of stories, a string of breaches, and the public don't know the details. I mean, I could probably recall the details if I sat here with you, but what people get is the vibe, and the vibe is one rule for me, another rule for you. And that sense of us and them in politics, the great binary in politics is on your side and out of touch. If you can own on your side, Johnson was on your side if you were for Brexit, made that election, and Corbyn was out of touch. What's happened is that Johnson's lost that sense of being on your side. He's out of touch. 68% of the public think he's a liar, a hypocrite, and should resign over breaking the rules during lockdown. 32% disagree. That is the core Tory vote. That means every swing voter in Britain has made up their mind about the Prime Minister. And the thing is, some things damage you and then go away, but in my view, some things damage you permanently because they show who you are. The public don't see the character of politicians. They see their leadership in action. They see their judgments in action. And sometimes you just get this, you see something and you go, oh, that's who you really are. You're, you're not the life and soul of the party you're holding parties. You're not the guy who makes me laugh because you tell funny stories. You're the guy who's laughing at me. So the idea that the PM is looking down on all of us is a real problem for him. And I think it has formed a view. And if you look at the polling since the Ukraine war, there hasn't been a rally around the flag effect. That basically the verdict is in. There'll be some recovery, I'm sure, for the Tory party, but the Prime Minister himself, people know who he is, and I think he knows who he is because when he made his first apology, the big apology to the House of Commons, there's been a number of apologies, but the first apology he had to make, he looked deflated and defeated. He looked like a man who, behind his eyes, knew that he was leaving office, out of office. He's recovered since then because everybody has a chance in politics. If you live a day, you live to fight another day. You live to fight another day. You live to fight another day. So he believes, and I kind of believe, that he'll be the Tory candidate at the next election. He'll be the Prime Minister at the next election. But I think that's bad for them, not good for them. And I think the broad public verdict is in, which is why I say I think the Tories have lost the next election, but I don't think they've settled on Labour as the answer yet.
The invasion of a Western liberal democracy by the Russians a couple of weeks ago, has that provided an opportunity for a circuit breaker domestically for Johnson? Is he looking at it as a life raft? Oh my God, please stop talking about me. Can we talk about something else, you know?
Yeah, look, he's like Mr. Micawber in Dickens. Like he always wants something to turn up. So this has turned up. The invasion has turned up. He's not had a great he's portrayed himself in the UK press as being the decisive factor in standing up to Russia, mainly by trying to bankrupt my football club, Chelsea. But the decisive choice in this conflict, the choice has been made by Joe Biden, President Biden, and by Chancellor Scholz in Germany. So Scholz is somebody you definitely should do a program with somebody who can talk about the Social Democratic victory in Germany. I'm trying to write a piece for the Financial Times about the revival of social democracy in Europe. You know, we're there in all the Nordics, we're there in Germany, we're there in centrist in Italy, we're there in Spain, we're there in Portugal, and there's going to be a progressive victory again in France. So the return of centre-left politics, the quiet return of centre-left politics has been going on. But Scholz is a leader. Scholz just took this opportunity, not consulting the cabinet, not consulting his party, not consulting the coalition party, going, Germany is going to make defence a third pillar of the European Union. We have the economy. We've always had the economy. We've had culture. We've always had culture. We're now going to make defence security a thing. So Europe has changed. European politics has changed. Biden, with the way that they released intelligence, you know, saying what the Russians were going to do before they did it, it was great because it kind of framed things in the information war, saying if this happens, it'll happen because the Russians are trying to pretend that this happens. But also, it must be undermining for the Kremlin because it proves America's got deep and accurate sources at the very top of the Russian government. So Biden's played blinder. Scholz has played a blinder. The European Union has come together to address the refugee crisis, amongst other things. And Boris just trying to bustle his way in, trying to get his way in there. And yes, it's deferred. Yes, it is deferred some of his crises, but he's still the only prime minister in British history to have been interviewed under caution, albeit in a questionnaire, but interviewed under caution by the police. He's got a whole bunch of staff being interviewed under caution by the police. There's a question of fines to come. He could be fined. His staff could be fined. And then after the police, there's a civil service inquiry by a senior civil servant called Sue Gray, who is a secretary of one of the departments. More importantly, she used to run propriety and ethics for the government in the centre of the government in Cabinet Office. But possibly more importantly, when she took her career break in the 80s, she ran a pub in Bandit Country in Northern Ireland. So anybody who's run a pub in Bandit Country in Northern Ireland need not fear the best wishes of the Prime Minister. So I think she'll find without fear or favour in her report. So there's loads of things to come back. And, you know, there'll be an attempt to blame the Russians for inflation, but the Russians aren't responsible for Britain not having an energy policy. You know, one of the tropes of the current government, which is really interesting, is they keep announcing in their fourth term, it's time to do something fundamental about energy. It's time to do something fundamental, implying that everything that's gone before, and what they do is they say for decades, governments haven't addressed this issue. It's like, but you've been, you know, wait till you find out who's been in charge since 2010. So there's an element of the Prime Minister's character, which is he lives in a permanent present. So like everything he did before is irrelevant. It's like what he says now, and it's worked for him for a very long time. And the government is governing like that. They're trying to say, yeah, we may have no gas storage, but we'll address that right now. We may not have had a plan for keeping the lights on. We're going to have one now. We may not have had a plan. So they're trying to make themselves into a completely new government, addressing all these fundamental questions. And I think the issue is the public do remember that they have been around for a while. You can't have been around for ages and it not been your responsibility. So to land that, Labour is going to need some symbolic policies, some key attacks that it comes back to again and again. But I don't think the war is going to wash the memory of the parties, and we call Partygate over here, the parties and the Prime Minister's behaviour away. And it's not going to be a compensation for, you know, it's going to be 2 years till the next election. In 2 years' time, every household will pay £3,000 on average more in taxes. They will be told that has been done to help the National Health Service, to help restore the health system after the impact of the pandemic. But we already know waiting lists for operations and treatments are going to carry on rising for the next 2 years. So Labour's campaign could be really simple. You know, is your tax burden high? Are you paying more tax? Yes. Is your local health service sorted? No. For Labour. I think the accumulation of grievances, real, practical, proximate grievances, health and housing and elder care and inflation, those things, you know, you can wrap yourself in the flag as much as you want. You can wear khaki as much as you want. Hopefully, there will not be a conflict in Ukraine by the time we get to the next election. There will be a settlement and a reconstruction program and a peace settlement which gives justice to Ukraine, which keeps Russia in a box, which resets relations with China, which does a load of geopolitical things, and then has 100 billion, 200 billion, possibly £250 billion pound, so $500 million, $500 billion reconstruction program aimed at restoring Kiev, Kharkiv, Mariupol, Odessa, restoring Ukraine. And then at that time, it's going to be, I think, you know, the PM will try to claim credit and look backwards. Whoever the Tory leader is going to say, look, we had a good war. And the thing is, once again, back to one of my themes, you don't get thanked for what you did. You get votes for what you promise for the future.
I'm conscious of the time, but I do want to ask you a question about Europe. I wouldn't go so far. I don't think it'd go through so far as saying that it was going through an existential crisis, the European Union, with Brexit, but it certainly was getting kicked in the pills a bit. And the fabric of the union seemed to be starting to be frayed. And then this has happened. Not that we ever wanted this, but just give me a sense of what is going on in Europe at this point in time because of the attack on the Ukraine.
So Europe had fundamental structural and existential problems before Brexit. And those fundamental problems were the single currency as a project was an economic punishment for southern European economies, for Spain, Portugal, Italy, Greece. Greece had the well-known crisis, the debt crisis, and the austerity enforced on it by the European Union. And that was essentially a very, very conservative German monetary policy being imposed on southern European countries who had to take it because they want to stay in the euro. Europe also had an East-West legitimacy crisis in that if the European Union stands for anything, it stands for the rule of law and for democracy. It was the route for former Warsaw Pact states, former Communist Party states, to become democracies, to be rich economies, to become members of NATO. And yet Orban in Hungary and the governments in Romania and Bulgaria, autocratic, undemocratic, absolutely leaning towards Putin's Russia. And a far right in France under Le Pen and in other countries, the Sweden Democrats, looking towards Putin too, allegedly taking Russian money, but definitely Russian disinformation was supporting these parties and the fragmentation of the democracy and the democratic discourse in those countries. You had all of that, so north, south, and east-west crises going on. Temporarily, Brexit united people because they could all agree to be anti-Britain, well shot at Britain, and Britain leaving gave a temporary sense of unity to the European Union. What this crisis has done is it's made people choose. So Orban in Hungary, the Polish government, have chosen Europe in a big way. The European Union, the norms of the European Union. The far right are pretending they never met Putin, they never liked him, they never had anything to do with him. Even Nigel Farage in our country, in the UK, who ran the Brexit campaign. So you've had that reset, and you've had, as I said, Scholz putting Chancellor Scholz, the Social Democratic Chancellor of Germany, putting the party at the heart, Germany at the heart, by saying, actually, we're no longer stand back on defence security. We're no longer going to want our gas from Russia. There's a clean break here. There's a new border. There's new behaviours expected, and I think that's given a new, if you take it seriously, economics, culture, and defence security as three pillars of the European Union make it into a very different geopolitical force. And if Finland and Sweden are now on the track to join NATO, NATO looks different. NATO is much more European. And the longer term project, it has taken decades to create an ethno-nationalist, militaristic, autocratic culture in Russia. We saw it happen in Japan before the Second World War. We saw it happen in Germany from the time of the Prussians right through. We saw how much was required to demilitarize German and Japanese culture after the Second World War. There's going to need to be a new Ostpolitik, a new politics to the East, a new politics towards Russia. How can we support the demilitarization of Russia, which is an amazing thing to think about, given it's a nuclear power. But actually, there has to be, and China has to be a partner in this, which changes the way we have to think about China. So there's a geopolitical reset going on, which I think, in a way, is why a khaki election, a wartime election, is not going to work for Boris Johnson. I don't think it will work for Scott Morrison. What the public aren't stupid. They understand when things are really, really big. This is really, really big. This is not a matter of having big defence forces in Australia or whatever. This is a matter of how do we get through this century with a situation where a nuclear power has crossed the red line of saying we'll use nuclear weapons in a regional conflict. How do we get through this century where we still have to get to net zero? So we kind of the terms of the next century are being set, and from my point of view, the challenge for progressives is to have an economic and a cultural and a defence and security narrative in our countries and in our alliances, regionally and globally, that we can build on to make the progressive case, because we've gone through a period, post-war, it was a progressive settlement. Post the OPEC crash, outside of Australia, it was broadly a neoliberal reset by a Reagan-Thatcher reset. well, there's a big reset coming. So what's the frame of those politics? And that is kind of amazing to think about, and deeply demanding of all of us, but it's quite exciting too.
And that would be another good podcast for us to have in the future. But I know you need to go. So John McTernan, once again, thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate the chat. As always, I absolutely could listen to you for hours.
That's great.
But, you're a busy guy. But here's hope. Let's have a beer soon. I'm looking forward to
it. Yeah. See you soon.
Thanks for listening to Socially Democratic. Did you like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcast or Podchaser. And to get all the latest on Socially Democratic, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And we'll see you next Friday.